tonight to this webinar on visually impaired athletes. And we are very, very fortunate to have two presenters with us this evening, both of them ITOs, one from Canada and one from the United States. And that's with the World Para Athletics. So I think everybody knows David Weicker from Canada, but joining him this evening is Jerry Clayton from the United States. And I know that you signed in to hear them, not me. But before I turn it over to them, if everybody would please mute their computers so that we hear only the presenters and not your background music or noise, as well as if you would turn your video off so that we can all concentrate on the presentation, that would be absolutely fantastic. And I know that David and Jerry will be entertaining questions at the end. So at that point in time, we can unmute and entertain your questions. So if everybody would right now mute their computers, stop their video, and I will turn it over to David and Jerry.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jane. Serge, you want to flip to the next screen?
Got it, David?
Yep. Okay, so I'm David Weicker, a World Para-Athletics educator, technical delegate, and ITO, and I'm also a member of the International Panel for Chief Photo Finish Judges. That's for both World Para and World Athletics.
And I'm Jerry Clayton. I'm talking to you from Colorado down in the United States. I'm also an educator with World Para Athletics, a TD and an ITO working for them.
And trivia, Jerry was my boss the first event I did, and I've been learning from Jerry ever since I started with World Para Athletics.
And now our roles are reversed.
Okay, next slide, maybe two. Yeah, go one more. Yeah.
One more?
So the classifications for visually impaired are track or field 11, so TF11, which are totally blind, a TF12, they have some sight, and a TF13, they have some impairment, but not much. Okay, Serge? So general conditions for track and field 11, they must wear eye patches, the athletes, to cover eye cavities, plus wear an eye mask or approved opaque glasses. And I've got a note here that is important because athletes sometimes will show up to the call room without their own, but it's their responsibility to provide their own equipment. And if they don't show up without them, in some cases, there may be eye patches, and in some cases, there may be an eye mask in the call room, which is available for athletes. But in all cases, they must wear the eye patches until the event is complete. They must run with a guide. Again, these are T and F11. They must run with a guide, and they may have up to 2 assistants for field events, except for, you'll see in a couple of minutes, for throwing events. So track and field 11, again, they must run with a guide, they must use a tether, and they must use the tether properly, and the guide cannot finish before the athlete. They may have up to 2 assistants for field events. 1 assistant can orient and 1 can call. So that would happen likely in a long jump. But they don't have a caller for throwing events. And the assistants normally sit in a separate area when the athlete is not competing in a trial. So again, they must wear eye patches to cover the eye cavities, plus wear an eye mask or approved opaque glasses. And this is what the eye patches look like on the left, and the mask is on the right. So the mask is very similar to what you would see on an airplane, or you may see them in other places, but they're more common on airplanes than anywhere else. So for T12 athletes, they may run with a guide. If they do, they must use the tether and they must use it properly. And again, the guide cannot finish before the athlete. They're not required to wear a mask and they're not required to wear eye patches. They may only have one assistant for field events. And again, the assistants normally sit in a separate area when the athlete is not competing in a trial. For T13, they're not allowed to run with a guide and they're not allowed to have an assistant for field events. They compete somewhat as able-bodied athletes and they often do so. So you may see them in meets, in local meets, twilight meets, or anywhere else that are able-body oriented. So in summary, the T11s must have their eyes completely covered. The T11s and 12s may have guide runners, and they also, for field events, may have assistants for field events. The T11, T12, and T13 must use starting blocks for 100, 200, 400 plus relays, including the leadoff runners, or only the leadoff runners, and that would be for the 4x1 or for the universal relay. So for track events, that's what we'll talk about first. These are the events that they would normally compete in, but they don't compete in these events at all competitions. So it's 100 through 10,000. The 5,000 and 10,000, there are 2 guide runners allowed for T11 and T12 should they choose to use them. The 4x100 meter relay and the first leg of the universal relay is for a T11, 12, or 13 athlete. For road events, it's somewhat similar. For T11, they must run with a guide. They must use a tether and use it properly, and the guide cannot finish before the athlete. So the athletes must finish races before the guide runner. They do not, however, need to use eye patches or eye masks or opaque glasses for road events. So in this particular image, just a question for everybody, and you can use a thumbs up, the thumbs up icon if you want, to indicate whether you think the guide finished before the athlete. And in this case, it's also how can you tell and who makes the decision? And this is an intriguing one for photo finish people because it depends on where the camera is. If it's exactly perpendicular to the line, then in this case, the guide would have finished before the athlete, which means the athlete would be disqualified. And this was at the end of a marathon race in London. So who makes the decision? It's the technical delegate or the track or the off-track referee would make the decision, or the photo finish judge normally makes the decision on whether the guide finishes before the athlete. Okay, Serge, next. So also under conditions, guides must not push, pull, or propel the athlete at any time during a running event. And we have a video for this. We actually have a video or 2 videos showing this. Okay, Serge, next. So we're going to see 2 athletes starting out with the Chinese. And then we'll move to the, okay, Serge, you can play it. And then we'll move to the UK athlete. Now you can imagine a referee having to make a decision on this from where they are and what they're looking at, but it could also be a video referee making the decision. And if we play it again, we'll look at the Chinese and watch the right shoulder of the guide and the left shoulder of the Chinese athlete. And they're both entirely in sync. And if you watch the UK athlete, the shoulder is jumping up and down. So in that instance, the athlete was in fact disqualified for being pulled by the guide. And then the jury overturned the decision because they didn't see the same thing.
Dave,
Again,
you said the athlete, which one?
the athlete from the UK was disqualified and then reinstated.
Okay, thank you.
We're showing it one more time.
Oops, sorry.
It's too bad it's not playing at full speed. Okay, let's move on, Serge. We'll see if this one works too. Did the guide push or pull in this instance? And it's lane 7 we're looking at, which is in the far outside. I think you need to push play, Serge.
Should be running.
If you look at the guide, the athlete and the guide, they're from Spain on the outside. You can see that the guide is in fact pulling the athlete, or at that stage was pulling the athlete before the finish line. And the athlete was disqualified from Spain. Okay, let's move on, Serge. So this is what the tether looks like, at least in the rule book. And it doesn't have to be exactly like this, but it needs to have the same components. So the components are, it has the two ends that an athlete and guide would hold. An athlete would hold one end and the guide would hold the other, and that would be up to the red stopper. The yellow component is 10 millimeters, or roughly 4 inches, and an athlete must not, it says centimeters. The minimum length of a tether for track events is 30 centimeters, and for off-track events, road events, it's 50 centimeters. The athlete and the guide are not allowed to hold on to the red stoppers in order to shorten the distance between, nor are they allowed to touch arms or hold arms when they're running. And you sometimes will see that. So and that's the idea of having the 3 different colors. You will see the red stoppers, and it's easier to see an athlete or a guide who's touching or holding on to the stopper, or if they're pulling on the yellow component. Okay, Serge? So they must use the tether properly. They must use one similar. They must not shorten it in any way, hold the yellow part or the red stoppers. They must not hold arms or hands, must not let go of the tether during a race except for a guide exchange, and actually must be tethered until after the athlete passes the vertical plane of the finish line. Okay, Serge? I think we might have a couple of videos of guide exchanges. So this is in the 5,000 meters in Rio.
So for the uninitiated, and maybe your first time watching this in 4 years, maybe your first time watching this overall, but when they cross the line, the athlete has to cross the line first at the finish, ahead of the guide, otherwise it's disqualification.
We just saw then that the change.
So for the uninitiated, and maybe your first time watching this in 4 years, maybe your first time watching this overall, but when they cross the line, the athlete has to cross the line first at the finish, ahead of the guide, otherwise it's disqualification.
We just saw then that the change.
So for the uninitiated, and maybe your first time watching this in 4 years, maybe your first time watching this overall, but when they cross the line, the athlete has to cross the line first at the finish, ahead of the guide, otherwise it's disqualification.
We just saw then that the change.
Okay, Serge, maybe move to the next one. So we could see that there was a guide exchange and it was a good one. Just couldn't see it because it wasn't playing at full speed.
Wearing the
okay, and this is the second one.
Another little bit of swapping of guides happening, you'll see there. That is for the third placer for Kenya, wearing the gold singlet for Ecuador is Darwin Castro. Another little bit of swapping of guides happening, you'll see there. That is for the third placer for Kenya,
So the question is, did the exchange happen, and what do you look for, and what are the clues? So Serge is going to show it again, and what you will see, you can show it again, Serge, I'll just talk over it. What we'll see is the guide is coming to the exchange guide is the taller of the two Kenyans. He's now running alongside. He moves in, and all he does is just touch the third place athlete. You can see
wearing the
that the guide who's supposed to be exchanging is taller than the guy who's actually running.
See there. That is for the third placer for Kenya, wearing the gold singlet for Ecuador is Darwin Castro. Another little
David, just to explain it without having it, because I can't.
The athlete on the outside, Serge, if you can just highlight the athlete out there. He's the one who's going to come in for the guide exchange, and he's taller than the actual guide who's running in third place. And you will see that if it were playing in full speed, you would see that the there is in fact no exchange that takes place. And so what you're looking for is anything that can help you determine whether the guide exchange occurs, like the height of the athlete, like just watching it carefully or closely.
A little bit of swapping of
guides. Serge, do you want to play it one more time?
That is for the third placer for Kenya, wearing the gold singlet for Ecuador is Darwin Castro. Another little bit of swapping of guides happening, you'll see there.
And I apologize, I think the bandwidth is being sucked up by the number of people on the call.
Gold singlet for Ecuador is Darwin Castro.
Played perfectly when we were just playing them on our own.
Guides happening, you'll see there.
Just three of us.
That is for the third place.
Serge, are you able to show this in full screen again?
Wearing the gold singlet for Ecuador is Darwin Castro.
So you can see
another
out by the Rio sign.
You'll see there. That is for the third placer for Kenya.
This is the good guide exchange. You can see the exchange occurred there.
Wearing the gold singlet for Ecuador is Darwin Castro. Another little bit of swapping of guides happening, you'll see there. That is for the third placer for
So that was what we would call a good guide exchange. They were in fourth place. So the answer to the first question is no, the guide exchange did not happen. And what do you look for? As I say, you're looking for anything you can, like the height of the guide going in and the height of the guide going out, whether, you know, what they're wearing in terms of color of shoes, things like that. And this stresses the importance of having an ITO at the guide exchange because it's the referee that's responsible for making the guide exchange or determining the conditions for the guide exchange. Okay, let's show it one more time, Serge.
Gary's running it.
Okay.
Gold singlet for Ecuador is
you.
Darwin Castro. Another little bit of swapping of guides happening, you'll see there. That is for the third placer for Kenya. Wearing the gold singlet for Ecuador is Darwin Castro.
You can see the guide coming in and touching, but you don't see an exchange.
That is for the third placer for Kenya.
Okay, let's move on. Okay, so that sort of concludes the track side of things. Are there any questions? You may want to either unmute yourself and ask, or put them in the ask the question in writing. Either way.
David?
I'm sorry.
Darren Blois, I have a question.
Yes, Darren.
I'm a starter, so I'm interested in the start. And the question is, if a guide commits an illegal start or a false start, is the athlete disqualified for that?
Yes, they are running as a team, and it's a good question, Darren, because if they false start either one of them, then the team is disqualified. And if the guide pulls the athlete, then the team is disqualified. And if they push, pull, propel, whatever, or if the guide steps on the line or steps out of lane, then the team is disqualified. So that's what makes guide running a little bit more challenging.
David, did you pay him to say that?
Yeah, I paid Darren to ask that question.
Thanks, David.
Okay.
Can I ask a question, please? If you're using a guide runner in a distance race and you have said, I'm going to exchange guide runners like in that distance race there, and you don't do it, are you DQ'd or do you have to?
Quick answer, yes, the athlete and the guide are disqualified. When the new rule came into effect that said, if you plan a guide exchange and it doesn't occur, then you are disqualified as an athlete.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
This is Lily here. That was going to be my question. If the exchange doesn't happen, is it okay, or they're disqualified, but you just said they get disqualified?
Yep.
Thank you. I guess the other comment, I guess, is do they know the rules of that, or why won't they exchange?
Well, the athletes should know the rules, but you never know. They sometimes don't know them.
Right.
And those are what we call coaching errors more than anything else.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Claude has a question.
How many times can you exchange your guide runner?
You can have one guide exchange in a 5,000 or 10,000 and up to 2 guide exchanges in an off-track event.
Thank you.
Okay.
Claude, ask your question now.
Okay. How is the track referee or RTO knows if an athlete submit a request to use an exchange, because it sounds to be only an optional thing?
It is an optional thing, but it's there's a specific form used to do that, and they have to take the form into the call room when they register at the call room. And that's how the referee knows, and the referee has to make the arrangements. And oftentimes an athlete will say, I want to do the exchange at 2,500 or halfway through the race. And no one's asked this question, but the guide exchange always occurs on the back straight. That's the only place where it will occur. And so what will sometimes happen is they'll fill out a form, but they'll fill it out wrong. They'll say they want to exchange on lap 8, and they really mean lap 7, or they mean lap 9. And so it's just a dialogue to confirm where it will occur and at what stage during the race. And then once everybody agrees to it, then it must happen, or the athlete and guide are disqualified.
So you mean that you need to know where on...
If you need to know where the guide exchange, yes, where the guide exchange is going to take place. It's always on the back straight, and when it's which lap or at which part of the race will it occur. Usually which lap is what's done by the athlete and guide. But there's also an indication of the, at major competitions, there's an indication of the athlete number for the guide exchange. And usually when they register 2 guides for a race like that. So you will see a start list that has 2 guides listed on the start sheet. So that's how you would know that there's going to be a guide exchange. But again, that only happens at major competitions.
Dave, if you've got a visually impaired athlete running in a race, do both that athlete and their guide or their initial guide have to use starting blocks?
It depends on the race, but yes, if it's a 100, 200, 400, or a relay, both must use starting blocks, and in international competitions, that includes the start information system.
Okay, so it's not, you could never have it that the actual athlete does the starting blocks, but the guide does not.
Correct. They both must use blocks.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good questions.
Any other questions? If not, we'll move on to field events. And this is where Gary takes over in our relay.
Are you able to hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. We're going to talk about field events for the F11s, the 12s, and the 13s. As you just saw on track, things will be a little bit variable between them. We're going to look at long jump, triple jump, high jump, and then shot, disc, and javelin. So we're talking about the jumps and the throws. As we talked about earlier as well, when you see a T, it's a track event. Remember that the long jump and triple jump are now track events, and that sometimes can be a bit confusing. Now, visually impaired athletes, at least the F11s and 12s, are allowed assistance. And assistance in the first part, they can't be in the way of the judges. So if you're judging an event and the assistant is getting in your way, you should politely ask them to move to a different position. In the jumping events, F11s can have up to 2 assistants. So for example, in the long jump, typically what will happen if they choose to bring 2 assistants is one will go down the runway and help to orient the athlete. You might see the athlete holding their arms up, and the assistant will help point his arms directly down the runway, so he has at least initial starting position that's straight ahead. The other assistant will be standing down at the other end of the runway between the scratch board and the pit and calling. And they may do so in different positions, and I'll talk about that here a little bit more in a second. For the F-12s, no matter whether it's jumps or throws, they can only have one assistant. For throwing events, F-11 and 12s may only have one assistant. So it's kind of saying the same thing here. F-12s always have one assistant. For throwing events, the 11s can choose to have one assistant. Now, larger major competition, as you're well aware, we often have a variety of cameras out there, some fixed, some mobile camera operators, some belonging to the local organizing committee, and some part of the commercial broadcast system. Some of those cameras kind of need to be fixed by plan. That's where they're always going to be. And when that happens, you're kind of trying to be judicious about having your judges be in a slightly different position than they might otherwise want to be to make judges in terms of what's happening out there. Other mobile camera operators, certainly you can ask them to be moved around to get into a better position to where your judges can be. Or sometimes those camera operators get a little antsy and they move up a little too close or wander into the sector and put themselves in danger. So you certainly should ask them to move back to a more safe position. Before the trials, when assistants are orienting the athlete, they are allowed to do so by voice and touch. So they're allowed to talk to the athlete. It's not coaching. This is part of what their job is. They're allowed to do this. And they also can physically manipulate the athlete, whether they're getting on the runway for a long or a triple, or they're trying to get into the throwing circle for the discus. After the trial, the assistants may not touch the athletes, and this is important. So say for the discus throw, the athlete spins, makes the throw, comes to stop in the circle. The guide, who should not be in the cage at the same time, a little reminder of that from a safety standpoint, the guide can't reach in there and touch the athlete and help pull them out of the throwing circle. What he or she may do, however, is use vocal orientation to talk to the athlete and help orient them to exit the circle appropriately. Once they've made one touch outside the circle, the guide can certainly help physically orient the athlete. Let's see. Here's a typical diagram of the runway, and there are a few things that I wanted to kind of mention here. Number one, first off, is a safety point. You see that the width of the pit here in yellow. Can you see my cursor at all?
Yep.
Okay. We recommend that it be 3.5 meters in width. Why is that? We're dealing with people who, some of them can't see at all, and some have very poor visual acuity or have poor peripheral vision. And we like to have a wider pit, and many of the newer facilities certainly do that. But when you're going to some older schools or universities, these pits may be significantly narrow. And the appropriate way to deal with that is we typically find pads and put them on the edge so that the athlete, when they land, they don't wind up hurting themselves significantly by hitting the edge of the concrete deck coming down there. For T11s, the jump board is no longer that small board with a scratch line next to it. It is now an area that is 1 meter in length down the runway from the scratch line going backwards, and it's the full width of the runway. And what we do is we fill that with chalk, water, sometimes light sand, a variety of other things. The primary thing that we would like to do is not have something that gets really gooey and a mess when it gets a little wet outside. And what this does is it allows the footprint, when they make the plant to do the jump, is left in the powder, and you can use that footprint to be able to measure from to the closest point in the sand where the athlete has landed. and you can see the diagram down here has 4 different footprints, and I'm going to talk about that here so I can get the slide to move. Here we go. So if you look at A there in yellow, that footprint is over the scratch line. So you're not going to have a powder mark to worry about, but certainly you should be observant enough to note that that foot landed well beyond the scratch line, and it should be a foul. If you look back here in the blue area behind the white powder, you see a footprint, and the athlete, that represents an athlete jumping well before the powdered region, which really now is the board. This 1 meter long powder region is really the new board for these athletes. When you're back here on the runway, there's no powder, so where does the foot fall, right? So we have chosen in the rules to indicate that you measure from the nearest point in the sand all the way back to the back of that 1 meter powdered area. If you land in the middle of the powder area, you leave a nice clean footprint, and you measure from the toe of the footprint in the powder all the way out to where the landing was. Now you see down here in D, we have a footprint where you have the heel inside the powder, which is the board, and you have the rest of the foot sticking out here outside the board. That is a legal footprint for a jump because you've got part of the board. And the question becomes, well, where in the heck do we measure to indicate a point? Because in C, you measure to the toe of the footprint. Well, in D, you don't have any powder to find out where the toe was. So the rule of thumb is you measure from the point in the sand all the way back to where the foot is right on the edge of the line. You can see where the red arrow marks that point in the diagram. Sometimes not intuitive, and we've had people come up with different ways of doing that, but David, I think you would agree this is probably the best way to do it at the time.
Yep.
All right. As we indicated in the long jump, the F11 athletes get 2 assistants. So the one assistant would have oriented the athlete in this picture here, and unfortunately this video is not working, so I apologize, but the audio is. The assistant has already left. The athlete is standing there ready to go, and he's listening, and I'll play this. He's listening to the other assistant down at the end of the field. Runway. And each pair of athletes and their guides do something a little bit different. That's pretty typical to what you're here. I've seen an athlete from Russia where the guide had an amplifier and a speaker strapped to his chest, and he would call using the microphone all the way down there by the pit. It was rather unique, and we thought it was controversial at the other end of the point later on in the day. Indeed, it was legal. So if you see somebody using some electronics to amplify their voice, and what's the reason for that? If you're in a big stadium with 85,000 people in the stands, and they're raucous, they're excited, and they're thrilled about watching these athletes perform, it's really noisy. So trying to improve the ability of the athlete being able to hear their guides is really, really important. In fact, you have the capacity to really reach out and ask the audience to calm down and quiet down. Sometimes in a larger event, we'll actually get the announcer to ask the audience to try and be a little more quiet so that the athlete and the guides can perform together as appropriate and as is allowed by the rules.
And this is also why the long jump and triple jump for T11, T12 athletes is usually the first event of a session, because there are less people in the stadium and less people that you need to remind to be quiet.
For sure. Yeah, you can imagine. The one thing I remember was in London for the Paras in 2012. We had 3 of the Brits who were their biggest Paralympic athletes doing the 400 meter, and they were lined up at the start. And there we had a long jump with one of the better US athletes and a large crew of really, really good long jumpers. And they were trying to perform while the entire stadium filled with 85,000 people were screaming their lungs out because their heroes were out there about ready to race. So we actually got the announcer to type in on the big board.
I got it.
Please. And you can imagine what that was probably like. Okay, next slide. So you can see in this slide here, the athletes in the middle of the air on the slide, and you can see the dust inside this 1 meter long chalk line. It's located in the middle of the area between the 1 meter and 3 meter board in this particular runway. And again, it just demonstrates you can move this around. And one thing I might say is that sometimes, and especially if you're doing youth, is it's really helpful to look at the events and look at the qualifying marks and see what how long their jumps were. If they're barely clearing 3 meters, you certainly would not be wanting to use that 3 meter board. So you can use that as information to tell you where to put this 1 meter new visually impaired board out there. And it can be anywhere along the runway you think is appropriate and safe. You also might not want to put it too close to the pit because then they might overrun it and trip on the edge of the deck there. So just some little nuances you might think about as you're setting these things up. All right, for F11s, you notice in this particular, I'll show you in a second, there's an athlete standing here, and the green vest is the guide. And you can see that they're a mess. It looks like it's silver. It almost looks like duct tape from here. And we'll see what happens here. Our ITO from Brazil is walking up. The guide who's trying to orient the athlete comes up. She's up. Pull down the mask and covers her eyes. What happens a lot of times is sometimes these athletes high on their head, a little bit of movement perception underneath the mask and make them light. Dile que se la vuelta a tocar. La vuelta a tocar al primer And I don't know if that was a run through or a bailout. It's probably a run through. But again, that's very typical of how these athletes work together. It's amazing to watch the long jump and visually impaired athletes. They are amazing. These athletes and guides train together for long periods of time. They don't just suddenly go to a competition and pick a guide up from nowhere. It requires a lot of training to be able to coordinate all of this. Here's an example, another long jump. This is Lex Gillette. That's held the world record in the long jump off and on over the years. Let's just play the video. And the question I want to ask you, and this just if there's all kind of foul for this event. So we'll start the video.
So let's go back to the men's long jump, T11. Lex Gillette, his 4th round jump. Well, that's got it.
Athletes struggling here with the noise from the crowd. That one looked like it might.
You probably saw a few other things. Let's continue. It's going to be taken from a slightly different viewpoint or different camera. There we go.
Yeah, that has to hurt that. You see he goes off the track, he comes back on the guide there in front. Certainly is that dangerous. He's hit the side.
Lex told me indeed.
Yeah, that has really hurt. He's got up and ran away, but that.
So what I want to do here.
So let's go back to the
My
men's long
question
jump.
to you folks is there a foul at all? I would say yes, that there is. We were thinking about doing a polling and a quiz here, but it didn't quite work out too well. Hopefully we can do better about these going forward in the future. So was there a foul during Lex's run-up towards the pit?
No.
So the answer is...
So let's go back to the men's long jump, T11. Lex Gillette. His fourth round jump.
According to Rule 28.3
well, that's got
in the WPA rules, you can leave the runway during your run-up. Now, one thing that could have happened is the guide, the assistant standing next to the pit, could have waved him off. And as long as he stopped before he got to the scratch line, before he got to the board there, he would have been allowed to get reoriented and restart his run down the runway and make it a clean jump. Now, what would happen to the timekeeper? The timekeeper would have stopped his watch or stopped the clock at that point in time. And once the guide had reoriented the athlete on the runway, then as he steps away, the timekeeper would have restarted the clock, and then the clock would eat up the rest of that 1 minute they have to make their jump. Do you think there was a foul on the takeoff?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I'm going to try and back this up to see what you can see. Okay.
His fourth round jump. Well, that's got it.
Sorry, this is too jittery. Exits the runway. Plants his foot. Where's his foot? Is that inside or outside the board? Well, you got a big bright white board there. It's pretty easy to say. It's not like the example we gave in the early diagram where you had part of your foot in the powder and part of it out. So indeed, according to 28.1b, this Lex fouled when he made his jump. And then as you can see him landing there, you can see him landing on his rear end. It's a little bit better further on.
Athlete's struggling here with the noise from the crowd.
There's his plant. Nope, there's his plant. And he comes up and he jumps. And nice form, but unfortunately, his whole body lands outside of the sand. Oh. And then his arm goes in the sand. So,
Gillette.
So according to Rule 28.1d, indeed, that would have been a DQ because he landed on the deck before he hit the sand. So you can see that this can be a little bit complicated and requires a fair amount of attention to detail when your crew is watching these visually impaired jumps. But again, it's exciting to see world champions do this. It's amazing. I can't tell you how thrilled I get when I get a chance to do the long jump.
Hey, Jerry, I'd like to make one comment using that example. This is Carol DeWeese.
Yeah, Carol, please.
In that example, how far back the officials are from the runway, particularly up close to the board. Often you see long jump officials and triple jump officials like to get real close to the board. They put chairs down and so forth.
Yep.
It is a danger both to the officials and to the athletes. You can't control exactly where they're going. You need to be far back, and in fact, many cases, standing in this situation, as long as you're not bothering the TV cameras, is perfectly fine, because you're going to look for the plant and the mark on the board. You don't need to actually be there right close to it.
Agreed.
Anyway, it's a safety issue.
Yeah, and for all of our other viewers, Carol is another one of our World Para-Athletics ITOs. So you can see he's running off the runway, and had I been sitting in a chair right there looking at the board, guess what would have happened?
Most of you would have gotten injured.
Yeah, he'd have eaten it. And I have to say, I made that mistake once a long time ago, and I haven't made it since. So thanks for bringing that up, Carol. I really appreciate that.
Well, that's got athletes struggling here with the noise.
Okay, next one. So for the 11-12 field events, the rules for other field events are not really that different for the 11-12 athletes, except as we talked about earlier. And one thing I want to point out is that implements for throws are dictated by license from the IAAF, or World Athletics as they're now called, except for just a few implements. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to be doing a Zoom call on seated throws, and we'll talk about some of the implements that are used are actually only licensed and monitored by World Para-Athletics. So they are not used in able-bodied athletics. So T11s, what's unique in the high jump is they can actually walk up and touch the bar. It helps them get oriented. The T11s are the most visually impaired. They cannot see at all.
And apologies, David here, that slide should say F11, and it's my
You're right. That's a miss on my part too, and I've screened this a few times.
And the second bullet should be F12 and F13.
Right, exactly. So you'll see the F11s walk up to the bar and touch it. It helps them get oriented and get a feel for the height of the bar, where it is in position. They can have an assistant. They can walk out and feel for where they're going to make their foot plant and go over the bar. This is perfectly allowed for these individuals, and you can imagine why. Athletes in the 12 and 13, they're allowed to put, say, a light piece of cloth or something, or not a light, kind of something that's dark, perhaps red, as a visual aid to the bar. Because remember, the 12s are kind of in the middle. They're less visually impaired, and the 13s may have only a little peripheral vision issue or something like that, but they still cannot see as well as you and I perhaps can. So they're allowed to put something on the bar to help them see as they approach the bar. Now the 13s, as I just said, they are just a little bit blind, to be crude about it, but they do have a visual acuity difficulty, and it's important to recognize that. But they are essentially going to be competing without an assistant, and they often will actually compete in other events because they do have relatively fair visual ability. They don't get assistance. The F13s aren't allowed to have an assistant in any of the throws or any of the jumps. Questions? That's a lot to cover.
Jerry, it's Peter over here.
Yes, I had a question. In the triple jump or long jump, at what? Well, first of all, you said that you measure from the nearest point. Can you explain that?
Sure. Let me get back. Let's see if I can back up the slides here. Whoops.
Whoops.
Okay. So in this diagram, let's say pick C. So if the jump occurred and say it landed in this diagram, right, the closest point to the scratch board where the athlete made an imprint in the sand is right there where that 3 is. You would take your measuring tape and put the 0 there, and you would draw it all the way back until you see the toe of the footprint in the powder, right where my cursor is. Hopefully you can see my cursor. It's at the end of that arrow for C, right at the end of that. That's how you measure it. And it's the same for back here. If it's before the powder, you don't measure to the footprint because there is none. You measure to the very back of that 1 meter long powdered area, what's now called the board for visually impaired athletes.
No, I get that, but what happens if the jump into the pit isn't 90 degrees to the powder toe print?
You're gonna take what a lot of people see is they have a T-square, and they'll lay out a T-square to make sure you can draw a line over, so you can have a line perpendicular. Say this arrow down here is the T-square sticking out. You would make I think, and then run it back to whatever appropriate point it is from the plant to measure. Does that answer your question?
Essentially, it's just like able-bodied. You do an extension of the line, the takeoff board, or the takeoff line, and in this case, the extension would go from where the footprint in the powder is.
Okay. Thank you. I had another question too.
No different than how you do it for able-bodied. That was a good point, David.
I had another question too about the timer. At what point does the timer stop the time? They've got to be pretty alert.
Yes, they do. And the chief judge has to be on the ball. The chief judge should be well aware of that and be able to call for a time stop.
And what do you do to compensate for a slow timer?
I don't know. Maybe the athlete should pay the timer. To be serious, there's a limit to our physical capability of stopping the time. It's going to be a little bit off.
And in fact, it's also—
I would say if the time didn't get stopped for a while, then that might be a protestable part of the event.
Yeah, David here, just to comment, it's also difficult to determine when to start the time.
Yes.
So starting it and stopping it are both very difficult. And at European Championships in 2018, an ITO was actually telling the timer when to start the time and when to stop it. So an additional judge was there just to help the timekeeper.
Yeah. Yeah, you can imagine that the chief judge is pretty busy anyway. But yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, it takes people to be on the ball, and really somebody needs to indicate to the timer how and when to stop and start. The rule of thumb typically is when the guide orienting the athlete in the runway, when they release the athlete and they step off the runway, that's when the clock starts.
So it doesn't start typically when they begin their approach.
No, it's when when the guide gets off the runway, and as soon as he gets off the runway, the other guide that's down here begins calling, and that's the beginning.
Oh.
So they have 1 minute to initiate, to get going.
Okay, so on a typical bailout, when does the timer stop the clock? At what point on a bailout?
On a bailout,
yeah,
the chief judge should probably hear if they're going to bail out, and the guide that's down there by the pit tells them to stop. That would be and as long as it's before the board, then that's the time they should stop it. Would you agree, David?
Yes, I would.
Does that clarify it at all? It is an imperfect bit of event control. Agreed.
I see. Okay. Yeah, that clears it up somewhat. Thank you.
Sure.
And
feel free to get a hold of David and I. Our email addresses are at the end of this. We'd be happy to kind of have a discussion with you online.
Pritam has a question.
Yes, so it's about the rule for the vertical plane. Initially it was due to come in force as from November 2020. And now for World Athletics, going to go November 2021. Is it the same for Para?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. World Para-Athletics typically takes the tact that unless the changes that IAAF World Athletics makes if it doesn't impact us, we accept the rule changes as they are. There are occasionally times when IAAF will make a rule change and it does have an impact on our athletes, and then we will amend that change to suit our athletes. Does that help?
There are also cases where World Athletics are proposing a rule change and they don't realize the impact of that rule change. And one example is with electronic distance measurement in throwing events, where it's calibrated before the event and then calibrated after the event. But in one instance at the Para-Pan-Am Games in Lima last summer, there was a situation where a camera crew knocked the reader out of alignment, and therefore the readings were out by 30 centimeters. So it was not an inappropriate amount, it was a significant amount that it was out. And World Athletics were going to eliminate the need for having a check after the event, and since decided not to eliminate it.
Next question, John Monroe.
Okay, I've got 2 questions. Can you go back to that long jump diagram, please?
Sure, you bet. This one?
Okay. So you've got the assistant who's standing kind of beside the regular jump board.
Yeah, you'll see them do different things. Some of them will stand like right here. Can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Okay, they might stand here or here, of course, and lean in and stretch their hands out and clap and call down the runway. Some will stand right dead center in this space.
Okay.
And call and clap, and then wait until the very last second and jump out of the way. And it's a little scary to see some of them do it at the very end.
So the point is their physical position kind of gives away where the jump board is, and they're trying to position themselves in the middle of the runway.
Very intuitive. Absolutely.
What I'm trying to get to is why doesn't the second caller put themselves on the back side of the sandbox directly in the line coming down the runway?
The rules indicate that they can't be in the sand.
No, behind the runway. On your diagram, it would be in the white area to the right of the vertical line. Yeah, back there someplace.
Okay. To be honest with you, I've never seen anybody do it.
I've never seen it either. It's because it's too far away, typically, from the takeoff area.
Yeah, okay. That's a great question. I mean, really, in my experience, I have never seen anybody go to the back of the pit. Usually it's crowded with cameras.
There's that too. Okay, the other question I had was for the visually impaired high jump.
Yes.
The visual aid that the athletes can place on the bar.
Yep.
Is there any description as to where they're allowed to place it on the bar, or where they're not allowed to place it?
No. Typically, they'll put maybe a sock or a piece of cloth, and they can place it wherever it best suits what limited vision they may have. So remember, that's the 12s and 13s, the less visually impaired.
True, but it was just sort of like, I was curious whether there was something in the rules that said that they're not allowed to put it on the bottom of the bow in the pole, or that they had to place it kind of on the edge sort of thing.
Yeah, right. You'd almost expect that, but I'm unaware of any part of the rule that says that.
Yeah, there's no rule that says that, but they typically would have it 3/4 of the way down the high jump bar on one side or the other, depending on which side they jump
Right.
from.
Clayton from Denver, Colorado. Oh.
Would they put it on the side that they are approaching the bar from, or would they put it on the opposite side?
It all depends. It all depends on the athlete.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You know, you may your visual issues may not be bilateral.
Mm-hmm.
And as you're approaching the bar, if your right eye is poor, you might want to move that visual aid a little bit further down the bar so you can see it out of your left eye.
Okay.
But
thank you.
John,
sure, yeah, I hope that helped.
Is terrible.
Yeah, other people to having a question for David and Jerry?
Chris Holloway?
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, Chris.
I have a question, Lily here.
Chris first and Lily second.
No problem. It's okay. I can email either David or Jerry.
Chris,
please, yeah, feel free.
Okay, quick question. Is there a restriction on what they can place on there? Because if there's no restriction, technically they could put a 10-pound weight that would hold the bar down.
No, they can't put, the rules say it's a light weight flag or sock.
Right. It
Nothing
can't
heavy.
tape either.
Because the bar cannot, you know the rules on the bar, it cannot sag more than a certain amount.
Yes.
So those rules still apply.
Yeah.
Lily?
Good question, though. Yeah, absolutely.
Lily, you could ask your question. Lily?
Okay, I'm here. Yes, it's a quick question. It's regarding the USA Athlete Lex. Is the assistant allowed to sort of guide the athlete so the athlete can go basically straight in the runaway, and so it wouldn't, the athlete go outside the runaway and be hurt possibly?
That's a great question, and I forgot to really make a point about that again. I did it earlier. The guide, let's see if I can run this forward real quick. There's Lex running down, and right there is his guide. And where is his guide standing? He's standing right in the middle of the runway. He's clapping. Jerome, that's Jerome. He's clapping and he's calling. And he has a really unique sound and a unique voice. It really helps Lex. But what you didn't hear when I played the video was the announcer was actually talking, and he says, these athletes.
Well, that's got athletes struggling here with the noise from the crowd.
Play it again.
Struggling here with the noise from the crowd. That one looked like it might have hurt.
Yeah, that has to hurt that. You see,
Lex was disoriented. It was noisy in the stadium, and the announcers were talking, and it made it really difficult for him to hear his guide.
But is the guide allowed to say, keep going straight, for example, or you're going to your left too much, or you're going to your right too much?
There's nothing in the rule that says that they can't talk to guide them down the runway.
Yeah,
he could say that. Typically, they don't. I don't remember the last time I heard anybody talk to their athlete like that. David, have you or Carol?
No, I haven't, but they used to do that in 100-meter running at one point. Before they had guide runners, the assistant used to stop at the 50 meter, and they would say left, 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 right, 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 to indicate which way to go.
Yeah, it's a really good question. There's nothing that says that they could not do that. And
that's really scary and dangerous. The application.
Yeah, it is.
Really hurt.
Yeah.
But by the way, this is already answering that earlier question. Why do you not see the guide at the end of the run, at the end of the pit? It's because there's hard enough being this close for the athlete to hear, and also the guide to know exactly when that athlete's about to do his foot plant so he can give the signal.
Yeah, you can see Jerome standing here, and he's kind of part way out off the runway. he learned his lesson and got hit by Lex one time when he didn't get out of the way during practice. So they stopped that, and he typically will stand like this and lean in. Now he's also over there because he's clapping to help orient Lex to get back in the runway. And you see Lex has just come back into the runway. Maybe he overcompensated. I don't know.
Yeah. It was very noisy on the stadium, so. Yeah,
and you as a referee or chief judge, if it's a smaller event, if people are being noisy, and they're excited fans, we like that. But we always try and quiet down the audience a little bit to allow these athletes to perform at their best. They deserve it.
If the athlete can't hear his because of crowd noise, is that appealable?
Yes, it is. And typically what can happen is an official might hold a silence sign.
Yeah.
Or say, please be quiet. They might hold a sign just in front of the crowd. I've seen that happen a few times. Or
Sure.
the announcer just saying, quiet.
Look at the people. Look at the people in the stands. What people in the stands in this place?
Yeah, well, in fact, they're off to the right watching the, they're behind the judge.
They're behind this judge right there, for sure.
But in this case,
I have actually kind of faced the audience. I held one finger up against my lips, and then just kind of wave my hands. Like quiet down, please. And oftentimes they'll get the clue. Does that help answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Other question?
Yeah.
Other question?
I think it's Jane Edstrom's turn.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just, on behalf of the National Officials Committee and Athletics Canada, I want to thank both Jerry